Hello music makers, welcome back. I've had a few comments recently on an old video, my first failed attempt at describing arpeggios. I did a quick recreation of Eric Prydz's Opus. In hindsight, probably a bit complicated for a beginner's guide to arps. But these recent questions were about the sound, how to make it. Normally I would just do this kind of video as a short, but this sound has a little more going on, so seeing as we're doing a longer video, instead of just showing you the sound, I thought I would take you through my decision making and show you the whole process. A bit of sound design ear training, if you will. Let's go. By the way, I'm not claiming this sound is particularly accurate. I haven't actually A/B'd it recently, but seeing as I had so many comments asking how to make it, let me show you. So first, let's remind ourselves of the sound, and then I'll break it down bit by bit. So how did I get there? One of the most useful skills when it comes to working out sounds is being able to identify the tone, the underlying character. You'll hear some call this timbre. So underneath all of the effects and other possible alterations, which we'll get to in a minute, we're trying to listen for the fundamental makeup of the sound. For me, it starts with the basic waveforms. Does it sound like a sine wave? Does it sound like a saw wave? Or a square wave? Can you hear any of those characters in the sound? You'd be surprised how many sounds are built from just those. Anyway, I thought I could hear it was somewhere in between a saw and a square. Not a mixture of the two, not a combination. I'm not talking about layering one of each. I mean the sound has some of each characteristic. It's got a bit of the buzz of the saw wave, but also some of that hollowness, that flute kind of sound from the square wave. So, luckily, one of the wavetables here in Vital lets us fade between most of the classic waveforms. So that's where I started. Next, we need to pay attention to the sound over time, the volume envelope. This ARP is very much a Pluck kind of sound, so we're after something more like this. Sharp attack, a short decay, and I think I can hear a little bit of release too, where the sound lingers a little bit afterwards. Another element I'm listening out for is pitch. Obviously, I've already got the notes of the part played. What I'm referring to here is any alterations to the pitch within the sound itself. First of all, detune. Am I hearing a raw sound, or is it doubled or tripled or quadrupled via unison or an effect like chorus? Because those are two very different vibes. In the original sound, I can definitely hear some form of detune. Whether it's unison or chorus or both, I'm not sure. It doesn't really matter. Using some of that gets us closer to the right vibe. Especially if we keep the tuning or the timing rather tight, that gets us this kind of flanging effect. In fact, that is what a flanger does. Now, another form of pitch to look out for is pitch intervals, as in octaves, fifths, thirds maybe. Can we hear any extra pitches within each note? In the same way that the classic organ bass sound always has an extra fifth on top. Same with the famous Darude Sandstorm sound. That's actually made up of two pitches, a root and then a fifth, an octave above. In this Prydz sound, I can't hear any different notes, but I can hear possible octaves. It's got a very sparkly tone, and that could be one of two things. Either the waveform itself is producing those harmonics, or there are extra octaves added by extra oscillators. I'm going to take the latter approach because it's quicker than trying to fluke the right waveform. I'm just going to copy this first waveform for now, add one up one octave, that's 12, and then another one, an octave above that, at 24. Let's put a little bit of detune or unison on those. As you can hear, we're close to the main vibe of the sound now. The last thing we need to look at is frequencies over time. So we shaped the volume envelope earlier, that's volume over time. But another thing we need to listen out for is, do all frequencies stay the same over the length of the sound as well? In the original sound, I can hear some decay of the high frequencies, which indicates there's a filter, and that filter is also tied to an envelope. So the start of the sound is brighter than the end. Now add a little bit of delay and some reverb, and you're kind of there. Now, I say kind of. That is the principles of how I went about building the sound, but it's not the actual sound I showed you at the beginning. There are some little extra nerdy nuances to the final sound, but they're not essential to the building blocks of it. So I've left these until the end of the video. They're a lot harder to describe, and they take a lot more ear training to spot. So this bit is kind of a level 2. Let me show you the final patch, and I'll talk you through some of the extra details. Here it is. I wasn't joking when I said there was a few extra bits. Let me strip this down to its basics so I can explain all the differences. So the first thing you might notice is the waveform is different. I found this one in the free Echo Soundworks pack. In its default position, it already had that combination of saw and square, but it's also labeled PWM. That stands for Pulse Width Modulation. What that is it lets us change the width or the pulse width of the up and down sections of the wave. And as you can see, when that downward pulse gets a lot narrower, the sound gets a lot thinner. And one of the timbre qualities I'm chasing for this, I can only describe as a wiry sound, a kind of thin buzziness. And the pulse width combined with the saw square hybrid helps me get a little bit closer to that. Now you'll also notice it's on the move, it's changing over time. That's because I've tied it to the same envelope as the filter. If you saw my video on how I was wrong about the respace, I showed in that video how changing pulse width over time creates a kind of detune effect all on its own. And the quality of that has more of that wiry and flangey quality that the really tight detune does as well. Let me take off the detune and you can hear the pulse width modulation on its own. Now, as for the next oscillator, the one that's 1 octave up, that's the same wave again, but I've pulse width squeezed it even more using Vital's own wave distortion feature. The main reason I wanted this so thin is because in its default value, there were a few too many overlapping frequencies in the mids. I want the pitch, but not all of those overlapping harmonics. You'll notice this one is also on the move, although this one is on a very gentle sway via this LFO. No particular reason I changed the method on this one. The slower motion does give it more of a chorusy type effect, and sounds constantly in motion which aren't related to the triggering of the sound itself tend to have more interest over time. It gives it a little bit more analog type character, so the sound is not exactly the same every time it's triggered. For the third oscillator, the one that's 2 octaves up, this is the same waveform again, but I'm using one of Vital's other wave distortion features called Sync. I explain this in a little more detail in my sound design videos, go and check those out if you want. But in a nutshell, I think of Sync as like formants for synth waves. Formants are those kind of chipmunk effects when you pitch vocals up and down. Adding a little bit of sync to this wave helps us get closer to that sparkly top end. One other change is I added a tiny bit of white noise that's been filtered through filter 2 using a bandwidth filter here. So it's cutting out the lows and the highs. We're just letting the high mid frequencies through. Just trying to add a little bit more to that upper fizz. Then filter 1 is doing the same as I showed earlier. That's tied to envelope 2 still. But another difference is this addition of envelope 3, and that's being sent to the pitch of the first 2 oscillators. It's an extremely quick spike, and it's sending the pitch up by a few octaves, although it's too fast to detect the actual pitch. The purpose of this is to add some more attack to the pluck. Lastly, on to effects. You can see here I've added an EQ with a big notch in the middle. The high pass we can ignore, that's just a general mix thing, stop it interfering with the bass. But this notch is also the same reason I added the phaser. As you become more experienced, one thing you get used to listening out for is phase cancellation. And one thing I thought I could hear in the original sound was some kind of cuts in the mids somewhere. I tried to do it with the second oscillator as you saw earlier, that was one reason for it. Here is another attempt at that. So I added the EQ dip and then added the phaser too. Same reason. Phasers, if you don't know, just effectively are lots of EQ dips being moved around over time. It's a very similar effect to something called comb filtering, which is an artifact you get from higher frequencies phase cancelling. Then speaking of phasey sounding effects, chorus. Why not? We've already got the detune on the oscillators themselves, of course. This is kind of more of that, although slightly different. Again, independent of the triggering of the notes. Some of that movement I added to oscillator 2, same reason. Also, what's more 80s than a good chorus? And this sound certainly is very 80s. And then a final filter, just rolling off a little bit of the highs. One thing I especially appreciate about Eric Prydz' engineering is he doesn't usually overdo it on the top end. You can tell he's been to a lot of club nights without some earplugs because his stuff never really sounds that harsh when played out live. Then lastly, we have delay and reverb. If you want to know, the delay timing I used was a 16th triplet. And the reverb I chose was a good old Tal 4. It has a nice balance between harshness and smoothness. It doesn't sound too expensive. It lets the high frequencies rattle around a little bit, which is good for emphasizing the top end of our pluck. But it doesn't sound too cheap either. It doesn't have that ringing artifact that you get on some cheap reverbs, as long as you keep the diffusion quite high. Okie dokie, there we go. That's my attempt at the Opus Pluck sound. All synths and effects shown in the video were free. I'll link them down below, alongside the final preset. Let me know if you found this format of tutorial useful. If you did, do me a favor, hit like, maybe consider subscribing. Let me know in the comments what you thought, and there's a link in the description to buy me a coffee if you're feeling really generous. Until next week, I will see you in the comments. Bye-bye.